I've always loved the hum of an airplane cabin at night, the soft, rhythmic drone that lulls you into a false sense of peace. That night, somewhere over the Atlantic, I was nestled into my window seat in row 23, a thin airline blanket draped over my lap. My husband, David, sat beside me in the aisle seat, his broad shoulders brushing mine as he flipped through a magazine. We were on our way home from Paris, a trip meant to rekindle something we'd lost over 10 years of marriage. I'd fallen asleep with my head against the cool glass, the stars blinking faintly beyond the clouds, trusting the world to stay as it was. I woke up to silence, not the kind of silence you expect mid-flight. No engine hum, no rustling of passengers, just an eerie stillness. My neck ached, and the blanket had slipped to the floor. I rubbed my eyes, expecting to see David's familiar profile, but his seat was empty. The magazine lay abandoned on the tray table, folded open to an article about Bordeaux wines. I frowned, glancing around. The cabin lights were dimmed, most passengers slumped in their seats, asleep or lost in their screens. Where had he gone? I stretched, figuring he'd slipped off to the restroom. The flight was long, 8 hours, and we'd been served dinner a while ago. Maybe he'd needed to stretch his legs. But something nagged at me. The air felt off. Too quiet. Too still. I leaned into the aisle, peering toward the back of the plane. The galley curtain swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. A faint laugh drifted through the stillness, a woman's voice light and teasing. My stomach tightened. David wasn't one for chatting up strangers. He was charming, sure, but reserved, the kind of man who'd rather read than mingle. I told myself it was nothing, just a passenger flirting with a flight attendant. Still, I unbuckled my seatbelt and stood, smoothing my sweater. The aisle stretched endlessly before me, a tunnel of shadowed faces and flickering seatback screens. I moved toward the galley, my socks silent on the carpeted floor. The curtain parted easily under my fingers, revealing a sliver of light. I paused, listening. That laugh again, closer now, and a deeper voice, familiar, murmuring something I couldn't catch. My heart thudded. I stepped forward, peering through the gap. There was David leaning against the counter, his back to me. Across from him stood a flight attendant, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek bun, her uniform crisp despite the late hour. She twirled a strand of hair that had escaped her bun, smiling at him in a way that made my chest ache. "Just one more," she was saying, her voice lilting. She held out a tiny bottle of red wine, the kind they serve in first class. David took it, his fingers brushing hers longer than necessary. "You're too kind," he said, his tone warm, intimate. The tone he used to use with me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a casual chat. This was something else, something that made the air taste bitter. I ducked back behind the curtain, my mind racing. Was this real? Was I still dreaming? I pinched my arm hard. The sting was sharp, undeniable. No, this was happening. My husband was flirting with a flight attendant, while I slept 20 rows away. But then came the twist I didn't expect. As I steadied myself against the wall, ready to confront him, I heard her say something that stopped me cold. "She'll never know, David. Not if we're careful." My blood turned to ice. She knew his name. She knew me. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was planned. I pressed myself against the wall, the galley curtain brushing my shoulder as those words echoed in my mind. "She'll never know, David. Not if we're careful." My knees trembled, threatening to buckle. They weren't just flirting, they were conspiring. About me. The woman I'd been 10 minutes ago. The one who'd fallen asleep trusting her husband. Was gone, replaced by someone raw, alert, and very, very angry. I peeked through the curtain again, careful not to rustle it. David tilted his head, sipping the wine. His expression relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. "You're right," he said softly. "She's out cold. Always is on these flights." The flight attendant, her name tag read Claire, smirked, leaning closer. "Good. Then we've got time." Time for what? My pulse hammered in my ears. I wanted to storm in, demand answers, but something held me back. If this was planned, if she knew me, there was more to this than a mid-flight betrayal. I needed to know how deep it went. I slipped back into the shadows of the aisle, my mind spinning. Who was she? How did she know David? And why did her voice sound faintly familiar, like a memory I couldn't place? I returned to my seat, sinking low, pretending to adjust my blanket. My eyes stayed fixed on the galley. Minutes ticked by, 5 then 10. David didn't come back. The cabin remained unnaturally quiet. The hum of the engines a distant murmur. I glanced at the seatback screen. 35,000 feet, 4 hours to New York. Plenty of time for whatever they were plotting. Then I saw her. Claire emerged from the galley, her smile gone, replaced by a sharp, purposeful look. She carried a tray with a single glass of water and moved down the aisle. Not toward me, but past me toward first class. I twisted in my seat, watching as she handed the glass to a man in 3A, a gray-haired figure in a suit. He nodded, said something I couldn't hear, and she retreated to the galley. Odd. First class had its own crew. Why was she up there? David reappeared moments later, sliding into his seat with a yawn. Hey, he said, noticing me stir. You're awake. His voice was casual, but his eyes darted to mine, searching. I forced a sleepy smile. Bathroom? He nodded too quickly. Yeah. Long line. A lie. I'd seen him in the galley the whole time. I let the silence settle, my fingers tightening around the blanket. Then I noticed it. A faint smudge of red lipstick on his collar, barely visible in the dim light. Claire's lipstick was pink. This was someone else's mark. My stomach lurched. Was there another woman? Or was this a clue to something bigger? Before I could dwell on it, the plane jolted. A sharp dip that sent trays rattling and woke half the cabin. The seatbelt sign pinged on. Ladies and gentlemen, came the captain's voice, steady but clipped. We're hitting some turbulence. Please remain seated. The plane steadied, but my heart didn't. Turbulence didn't explain the chill creeping up my spine. I glanced at David. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. You okay? I asked, testing him. He nodded, but his hand gripped the armrest a little too hard. He knew something I didn't. And I was going to find out what, starting with Claire and that man in 3A. The turbulence subsided, but the unease in my chest only grew. David's grip on the armrest loosened, and he forced a smile, muttering something about bumpy rides. I nodded, playing along, but my eyes kept drifting to that lipstick smudge on his collar. Red bold, a silent accusation. Claire's pink lips didn't match it, and that gnawed at me. If not her, then who? And what was this time they needed while I slept? I waited until David's breathing slowed, his head lolling against the seat. He was pretending to sleep. I knew the rhythm of his real snores too well. Slipping out of my seat, I padded toward the front of the plane, my socks muffling my steps. The cabin was a sea of shadows, passengers cocooned in blankets or glowing screens. I needed answers, and that man in 3A seemed like a good place to start. First class was a different world. Wider seats, softer lighting, a faint scent of lavender. The man sat alone, his gray hair catching the overhead light as he sipped the water Claire had brought him. His suit was impeccable, a silver tie pin glinting like a tiny blade. He looked up as I approached, his eyes sharp, assessing. Lost? He asked, his voice low, accented. Eastern European, maybe? No. I lied, keeping my tone light. Just stretching my legs. Long flight. He raised an eyebrow, unconvinced, but gestured to the empty seat beside him. Join me then. Turbulence makes for poor wandering. I hesitated, then sat, my mind racing. Up close, he had a hawkish face, all angles and intensity. A thin scar ran along his jaw, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Traveling alone? He asked, swirling the water in his glass. I nodded, testing him. My husband's asleep back there. His lips twitched, a flicker of amusement. Lucky man to sleep through this. Something in his tone made my skin prickle. Did he know David? Had Claire told him about me? Before I could probe, he leaned closer, dropping his voice. You're a curious one. I saw you watching the galley earlier. My breath caught. He'd been observing me? I wasn't. I started, but he waved a hand. No need to deny it. Curiosity's a gift, but it can land you in trouble. His eyes locked on mine, and for a moment I felt pinned like prey. The curtain to the galley rustled, and Claire stepped out, her gaze snapping to us. She froze, then smiled, a tight, practiced curve of her lips. Everything all right here? She asked, her tone too bright. The man in 3A leaned back, casual now. Just chatting with a fellow insomniac. Claire's eyes flicked to me, a warning there, then back to him. Good. Let me know if you need anything. She retreated, but not before I caught the tension in her shoulders. I turned to the man, my voice steady despite the thudding in my chest. Who are you? He chuckled, finishing his water. A businessman. Name's Victor. And you? Laura. I said, the truth slipping out before I could stop it. His smile widened. Laura. A lovely name. Tell me, Laura, do you trust your husband? The question hit like a punch. Before I could answer, the plane lurched again, harder this time, and the lights flickered. Victor's glass slid off the tray, shattering on the floor. Over the intercom, the captain's voice crackled. Folks, we've got a situation. Please stay seated. Situation? My eyes met Victor's, and he murmured. Looks like the real turbulence is just beginning. The plane shuddered again, a low groan vibrating through the floor as the lights blinked erratically. Passengers stirred, murmurs rippling through the cabin like static. Victor's question, do you trust your husband? Hung in the air unanswered as I gripped the armrest. His calm demeanor unnerved me more than the turbulence. He didn't flinch, just watched me with those piercing eyes, the broken glass at his feet glinting like a warning. What's happening? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Victor shrugged, adjusting his tie pin. Mechanical trouble, perhaps. Or something else. His vagueness irritated me. But before I could press him, Claire's voice cut through the cabin over the PA. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing minor technical difficulties. Please remain calm and seated. Minor? The plane felt like it was rattling apart. I glanced back toward economy. David's seat was still occupied, his head tilted against the window now. Was he really asleep or avoiding me? I turned back to Victor. You didn't answer me. How do you know Claire? His smile was thin, evasive. She's attentive. Brings me water. That's all. A lie. I was sure of it. The way she'd looked at him, tense, knowing, suggested more. The lights steadied, but the plane's hum sounded off, strained. I stood, ignoring Claire's instructions, driven by a need to move to know. Sit down, Laura, Victor said, his tone firm. You'll draw attention. Maybe I want to. I shot back, heading for the galley. If answers were there, I'd find them. The curtain was half open, revealing Claire and another flight attendant, a brunette with a tight ponytail, huddled over a phone. The brunette's voice was hushed, urgent. Told him to wait, but he's insistent. If she finds out. She stopped as I stepped in, both of them turning. Claire's face hardened. Ma'am, you need to return to your seat. Who's insistent? I demanded, ignoring her. What's going on? The brunette hesitated, but Claire stepped forward, blocking my view. Nothing's going on. Just crew business. Please. Her politeness was a mask, and I wasn't buying it. I saw you with my husband, I said, low and steady. What's your game? Her eyes widened, just for a second, before she recovered. I don't know what you mean. I serve hundreds of passengers. Then why do you say she'll never know? I pressed. The brunette gasped softly, but Claire didn't flinch. You misheard. Turbulence makes people jumpy. She gestured toward the cabin. Go sit. Now. It wasn't a request. I backed out, my mind buzzing. Misheard. No chance. But as I turned, I caught a glimpse of the phone screen. Numbers, coordinates, not a text. A flight path. Before I could process it, the plane dipped sharply, throwing me against the wall. Alarms blared, and oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Passengers screamed, chaos erupting. I stumbled back to first class, where Victor was buckling his mask on, unfazed. Told you to sit, he said, almost amused. I grabbed a mask, my hands shaking as I secured it. David. I had to get to him. But as I looked back, I saw Claire rushing toward the cockpit, the brunette trailing her. The cockpit doors slammed shut behind them. Over the chaos, Victor leaned close. Your husband's not who you think, Laura. Neither is she. The plane leveled, but my world didn't. Who is David, really? And what had I just stepped into? The oxygen masks swayed like pendulums as the plane steadied, the alarms fading into an uneasy hum. My chest heaved beneath the plastic, each breath tasting of rubber and fear. Victor's words clawed at me. Your husband's not who you think. I ripped the mask off, the strap tangling in my hair, and stumbled toward economy. I had to see David, to confront him, to anchor myself in something familiar. even if it was a lie. The cabin was a mess, blankets on the floor, trays askew, passengers clutching armrests with wide eyes. David was still in his seat, mask on, staring ahead. I dropped beside him, yanking the mask from his face. "What's going on?" I hissed, my voice trembling with fury and dread. He blinked, feigning grogginess. "What? The turbulence?" "Don't," I cut him off. "I saw you with her. Claire. And that lipstick on your collar. It's not hers." His face paled, but he recovered fast, too fast. "Lipstick? Laura, you're imagining things. I bumped into a woman in the aisle." "Stop lying." I snapped louder than I meant. Heads turned, but I didn't care. "She said I'd never know." "What's she hiding?" "What are you hiding?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes, guilt maybe or panic. "You're tired," he said, reaching for my hand. I pulled away, the red smudge on his collar screaming betrayal. Before he could say more, the fasten seatbelt sign blinked off, and Claire's voice crackled over the PA. "We've stabilized. Apologies for the scare. Crew will assist with any needs." Stabilized? The plane felt anything but. I stood, ignoring David's protest, and headed for the galley again. I needed proof, something concrete. The curtain was drawn tight this time, but I heard voices, Claire's and a man's, clipped urgent. "Can't deviate now," he said. "He's on board. We stick to the plan." "And her?" Claire replied. "She's asking questions." A pause. "Handle it." My blood ran cold. Were they talking about me? I pressed closer, straining to hear, when the curtain jerked open. It wasn't Claire. The brunette flight attendant stood there, her ponytail askew, eyes wide with surprise. "You again," she said, her voice shaky. "What do you want?" "Answers," I shot back. "Why's Claire in the cockpit? What plan?" She glanced over her shoulder, then stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You need to stop. You don't know what you're messing with." "Then tell me," I urged, desperation creeping in. She hesitated, then whispered. "It's not just your husband. It's bigger. That man in 3A Victor, he's the key. But if you push, you won't make it off this plane." Her words hit like a slap. "Now make it off." Was this a threat, or a warning? Before I could respond, the galley phone buzzed, and she flinched. "Go," she hissed, shoving me back. I retreated, my mind reeling. Victor, Claire, David, a plan, and now a threat on my life. I glanced at David. He was watching me, his expression unreadable. Then I saw it. A tiny earpiece in his left ear, barely visible. He tapped it once subtly and turned away. The pieces didn't fit, but they were starting to form a picture. One I wasn't sure I wanted to see. I had to get to Victor again. He knew more than he let on. But as I moved toward first class, the plane's lights dimmed, and a new sound emerged, a faint rhythmic ticking from somewhere overhead. The ticking pulsed above me, faint but insistent, like a heartbeat trapped in the ceiling panels. I froze mid-aisle, my eyes darting upward. No one else seemed to notice. Passengers were settling back into their seats, grumbling about the turbulence, oblivious to the sound. Was I losing it? No. It was real, and it was wrong. Planes didn't tick. Bombs did. My throat tightened as I pushed toward first class, the thought clawing at me. Victor sat there, mask off, sipping a fresh glass of water like nothing had happened. His calm was infuriating. I dropped into the seat beside him, not waiting for an invitation. "What's that noise?" I demanded, keeping my voice low. He tilted his head, listening, then smiled faintly. "Engines, perhaps. Old planes have quirks." "It's not the engines," I snapped. "It's ticking. Like a clock. Or worse." His smile faded, and for the first time, I saw a crack in his composure. His fingers tightened around the glass. "You hear things others don't," he said, his accent thicker now. "A dangerous talent." "Stop dodging," I pressed. "You know something about David, Claire, this flight. Tell me." He studied me, then leaned closer, his voice a whisper. "You want truth. Your husband's a courier. Claire's his handler. And me, I'm the complication." "A courier?" My mind spun. "Courier for what?" Victor's eyes glinted. "Information. The kind people kill for." Before I could process that, he added, "The ticking? Not a bomb. It's a signal. They're listening." I followed his gaze to a small vent above us, tiny, unremarkable, but now sinister. Who's they? I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. The ones who hired him, Victor said. Or the ones who want him dead. Maybe both. Dead? My husband? I wanted to laugh, to call it absurd. But the earpiece I'd seen in David's ear flashed in my mind. He was wired. Connected. To what? I stood, my legs shaky, and Victor grabbed my wrist, not hard but firm. Careful, Laura. You're not invisible yet. His grip loosened, and I pulled free, heading back to economy. David was still in his seat, earpiece gone now, pretending to read his magazine. I sat, watching him from the corner of my eye. Enjoy your walk? He asked, not looking up. Yeah, I said, forcing calm. Met an interesting guy up front. Victor. His fingers froze on the page, just for a second, before he turned it. Oh, what did he say? His tone was too casual. Not much, I lied. Just that he knows you. David's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. He's mistaken. But the sweat beading on his brow said otherwise. The ticking grew louder, or maybe it was my pulse. I had to test him. He mentioned a signal, I said, watching his face. Something about a plan. David's jaw clenched, and he closed the magazine with a snap. You're tired, Laura. Imagining things. But his hand slipped into his pocket, and I saw the outline of something small. A device? A weapon? Before I could react, Claire appeared, her smile tight. Everything okay here? She asked, her eyes flicking to David. He nodded, but I caught the silent exchange, a barely perceptible head tilt from her. She moved on, and I leaned close to David. What are you carrying? I whispered. He stiffened. What? You heard me. Victor said you're a courier. For who? His silence was deafening. Then the plane jolted again. Not turbulence, but a sharp, deliberate lurch. The ticking stopped. And from the galley, I heard a muffled thud. The thud from the galley reverberated in my bones. A dull echo that snapped me out of the haze of David's silence. The plane lurched again, sharper this time, and the cabin lights flickered once before plunging us into near darkness. Gasps rippled through the passengers, but I was already on my feet, ignoring David's hiss. Laura, sit down. The ticking was gone, replaced by a chilling quiet. Too quiet for a plane still aloft. I moved toward the galley, my heart pounding a rhythm of its own. David grabbed my arm, his grip tight. Don't, he warned, his voice low, urgent. I yanked free, staring into his eyes. Eyes I thought I knew. You don't get to tell me what to do anymore, I said, and I meant it. Whatever he was hiding, I'd find it myself. The galley curtain swayed as I approached, the faint glow of emergency lights casting jagged shadows. I slipped inside, and the sight stopped me cold. The brunette flight attendant lay crumpled on the floor, her ponytail fanned out, a thin trickle of blood seeping from her temple. A tray of spilled coffee cups rolled beside her. She wasn't moving. I knelt, my hands trembling as I checked her pulse. Weak, but there. Hey, I whispered, shaking her gently. Wake up. Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't respond. Then I saw it. A small dart in her neck, barely visible beneath her collar. Not an accident. Someone had done this. Footsteps behind me. I spun, expecting David. But it was Claire, her face pale, her uniform sleeve torn. What did you do? I demanded, standing. She shook her head, hands raised. It wasn't me. She knew too much. Knew what? I snapped, stepping closer. What's David carrying? Who's Victor? Claire's eyes darted to the brunette, then back to me. You're in over your head, Laura. Walk away. Too late for that, I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing my chest. She said I wouldn't make it off this plane. Why? Claire hesitated, then muttered. Because you're a liability now. You weren't supposed to wake up. Wake up. The words hit like ice water. You drugged me. She didn't answer, but her silence was enough. Before I could press further, the galley phone buzzed and Claire flinched. She grabbed it, listening, then whispered, She's here. Yes, she saw. She hung up, her expression shifting to something colder. You should have stayed asleep, she said, pulling a syringe from her pocket. Not a dart, but a needle, glinting in the dim light. I backed up, my hip bumping the counter. Don't, I warned, scanning for a weapon. She lunged and I grabbed a coffee pot, swinging it hard. It cracked against her wrist, the syringe clattering to the floor. She cursed, clutching her arm, and I bolted past her, back into the cabin. David was standing now, his face a mask of alarm. "Laura, what?" "She tried to drug me," I shouted, loud enough for nearby passengers to turn. His eyes widened, but he didn't move to help. Instead, he glanced toward first class, toward Victor. The lights flickered back on, and over the PA, a new voice crackled. Not the captain's but a woman's, calm and commanding. "This is your new pilot. Remain seated. We're making an unscheduled stop." The plane banked hard, and I gripped a seat back, my mind racing. New pilot? Where was the crew? And why did that voice sound like the red lipstick I'd seen on David's collar? The plane tilted, my stomach dropping with it as that voice, smooth, unfamiliar, tinted with red lipstick confidence, echoed through the cabin. "We're making an unscheduled stop." I clung to a seatback, my eyes locked on David. He avoided my gaze, his hand back in his pocket, clutching whatever he hid there. Claire stumbled out of the galley, her wrist bruised, glaring at me before disappearing toward the cockpit. I pushed through the aisle, ignoring gasps from startled passengers, and reached first class. Victor was still seated, sipping water like we weren't careening toward chaos. "New pilot," I said breathless. "Who is she?" He smirked. "Someone who doesn't like loose ends." His calm fueled my rage. "And me? Am I a loose end?" He set the glass down. "Not yet. But you're close." The plane leveled, and I heard it again, that ticking faint from the vent. "You said it's a signal," I pressed. "For who?" Victor's eyes darkened. "The ones who want what David's carrying. Or the ones who'll kill to stop them." I leaned in. "What's he carrying?" He paused, then whispered, "A list. Names. Locations. Worth millions or wars." "A list? My husband, a suburban accountant smuggling deadly secrets?" Before I could respond, the cabin lights dimmed again, and the PA crackled. "Prepare for descent." Descent? We were hours from New York. Where were we going? And why did David's earpiece glint again in the shadows? The plane dipped lower, clouds streaking past the windows as that ticking pulsed louder, a countdown I couldn't ignore. I stormed back to David, his earpiece now blatant in the dim light. "A list," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "What names? What locations?" His eyes widened, fear cracking his mask. "Who told you?" "Victor," I cut in. "He says you're a courier. Claire's your handler. Tell me it's a lie." He pulled free, glancing around as passengers braced for landing. "Laura, you don't understand." "Then make me." I shouted. He flinched, then whispered, "It's classified." I didn't have a choice. "Classified? My husband. You chose to cheat." I spat, pointing at the lipstick. He froze. "That's not, it's complicated." The plane jolted, wheels screeching as we hit tarmac. Not an airport, but a rough strip, lights flickering outside. The PA buzzed. "Stay seated." Claire emerged, her syringe gone, face grim. She nodded at David, then me. "You should have stayed out of it," she said, moving past. Victor appeared behind me, voice low. "They're meeting someone. The list changes hands here." "Who?" I demanded. He smiled thinly. "Watch." The cabin door hissed open, cold air rushing in. A figure stepped aboard. Not a man, but a woman, red lipstick stark against her pale face. David stood, relief washing over him. "You're late," he said. She smirked. "You're alive. For now." My heart sank. I knew that voice. My sister, Ellen, stood at the cabin door, her red lipstick a cruel echo of the smudge on David's collar. The plane's engines hummed low, the strip outside desolate, no terminal, just shadows. "Ellen," I choked out. She turned, her smirk fading into something colder. "Laura, you weren't supposed to be here." David stepped forward, desperate. She woke up. "I couldn't." "Enough," Ellen snapped, her eyes flicking to Claire, then Victor. "Where's the list?" David fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a tiny drive. My stomach twisted. My sister, was part of this? You cheated with her?" I asked David, voice breaking. He shook his head. "It's not like that. She's my contact." Ellen laughed sharp. "Cheating? No, darling. Business." Victor rose, clapping slowly. "Well played, Ellen." But the list's mine now. He drew a slim blade from his tie pin, lunging. Chaos erupted. Claire tackled him. The drive skittered across the floor. I dove for it, clutching it as the brunette, awake now, staggered from the galley shouting, "They'll kill us all." The plane's engines roared. Ellen at the controls, she'd taken over. "New York's off," she yelled. "We're done here." I stood, drive in hand, facing her. "Why?" She sighed. "Money. Power. You wouldn't understand." I threw the drive out the open door into the dark. Her scream was the last thing I heard as David pulled me back, whispering, "I'm sorry." The plane lifted off, list gone, secrets scattered. We'd land somewhere, but not home.